Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into something truly massive. We're going to trace the entire epic narrative of human history. I mean, just imagine this. Around 3 billion years ago, we were literally nothing more than floating atoms in the grand petri dish of the world. Fast forward millions of years, our ancestors evolve, and eventually they step out of the wild to become landlocked farmers. We're going to travel from those very first muddy fields and ancient river valleys all the way to the pursuit of modern liberty and the signing of documents that changed the globe forever. We're charting the absolutely massive, repeating cycles of human triumph and, well, collapse, the rise and fall of civilization itself.
Okay, let's dive into this. We're going to map out 5 massive epics to understand exactly where we are today. The seeds of civilization, the age of classical empires, faith and feudalism, conquest and global shifts, and finally, Renaissance to revolution.
Section 1. The Seeds of Civilization.
So this is that monumental shift where humanity actually stopped relying on hunting and gathering and began building actual cities. Around 4000 BCE, right nestled between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the Sumerian city of Uruk blossomed. Why? Because its people figured out how to harvest and mill cereal grains like wheat. But they definitely weren't alone. By 3300 BCE, the Indus Valley civilization was absolutely thriving in modern-day Pakistan, complete with highly advanced underground plumbing. No way, right? And by 2100 BCE, this Shah dynasty formed in China around the massive agricultural hubs of the Yellow River. This just brilliantly illustrates how human ingenuity sparked the simultaneous rise of complex societies all across the globe. Basically, once we learned to control our food supply, our populations just exploded.
But, progress always comes with a cost. 5 foot 3 inches. That number represents a totally fascinating micro detail about our physical reality. When early humans transitioned from being these nomadic super athletes to landlocked farmers in Mesopotamia, their diets and all that strenuous repetitive labor actually altered their bodies. The average height of a man drastically shrunk, from 5'9" down to 5'3". It's a crazy paradox if you think about it. We built the first great cities, sure, but we became physically diminished, completely changing the essence of what it meant to be human at the time.
Now, as these early societies swelled to tens of thousands of people, they obviously needed rulers. Over in ancient China, we see the emergence of a really foundational concept, the mandate of heaven. The legend goes that figures like Yu the Great tamed the massive, absolutely devastating floods of the Yellow River. And because he saved the people, he was seen as having immense merit, and thus absolute power granted by the heavens. But this mandate was a serious double-edged sword. If natural disasters hit, we're talking famines, earthquakes, floods, it was a signal that heaven had actually withdrawn its blessing. This set up a continuous, repeating historical cycle where dynasties would rise, eventually fall, and inevitably be replaced.
Moving on to Section 2, Age of Classical Empires.
Nowhere is the clash of classical societies more visible than right on the Greek peninsula. Here we have 2 totally different ideologies thriving and inevitably colliding side by side. On one hand, you've got Athens, a major naval powerhouse experimenting with early democracy. They're randomly selecting council members by a lottery known as sortition and really nurturing philosophy and the arts. Then, on the other hand, you have Sparta, a strict oligarchy entirely dedicated to militarism and rigid physical conditioning, where literally every male citizen was molded from childhood for war. 2 completely, vastly different answers to the question of how a society should be run, just sharing the exact same tiny peninsula.
But when major external threats arrived, these rival factions had to pull off some impossible feats. Take the number 26.2 miles. Back in 490 BCE, the mighty Persian Empire attempted to conquer Greece, landing at a coastal city called Marathon. The vastly outnumbered Athenians actually managed a miraculous victory. To deliver the joyous news back to the city of Athens and, prevent total panic, a messenger named Phidippides ran the entire 26.2 miles from the battlefield to the city. That sheer scale of ancient endurance, that is exactly why we run marathons today.
Despite those epic victories, Athens ultimately fell into ruin and chaos. The constant voting of over 30,000 citizens in the assembly led to some fairly disastrous military blunders, like the failed Sicilian expedition. Watching all this chaos unfold, the great thinker Plato absolutely despised the idea of just random citizens holding power. He argued with deep conviction, "Till philosophers become rulers in this world, or till those we now call kings and rulers really and truly become philosophers." See, he wanted a philosopher king, a leader wholly dedicated to wisdom, logic, and justice, rather than just the fickle whims of a crowd.
But, as you might guess, putting absolute power in the hands of one man carries immense risk. The Roman Republic soon discovered this the hard way. Julius Caesar became wildly popular after his brutal conquest of the Gauls, and the Roman Senate grew absolutely terrified of his growing influence. So they ordered him to step down. The crucial point here is that Caesar had a choice: submit or fight. By legally defying the Senate and crossing the tiny Rubicon River with his army, he marked a true point of no return. After a bloody civil war, he emerged victorious and was appointed dictator for life. The Republic was officially dead, replaced by an empire.
Section 3. Faith and Feudalism.
Eventually, those grand classical empires overextended themselves, giving way to the Middle Ages. When those strong central governments collapsed, ordinary people were left incredibly vulnerable. Enter feudalism. This was a super rigid social pyramid where peasants were basically tied to the land. They spent their entire lives farming, giving up a heavy chunk of their crops to local nobles and knights. Now, you might be wondering, why on earth would they willingly trade away their freedom like that? Well, fear. With constant, terrifying raids from groups like the Vikings and the Magyars, peasants desperately needed military protection just to survive.
And this entire feudal necessity really arose because the greatest superpower in the West had completely shattered. The Western Roman Empire was permanently split, which made it weak. Then the unrelenting external pressures began. The Visigoths famously sacked the city of Rome in 410 AD. Attila the Hun, literally known as the Scourge of God, ravaged Roman territories. Finally, in 476 AD, the internal division reached its absolute peak when the Germanic general Odoacer deposed the young, final Western emperor. Just like that, the unified shield of Rome was completely gone.
Let's move over and see how this builds in the Middle East, where a massive new religious and political force was emerging. In 610 CE, Muhammad had his first revelation. Fast forward to 630 CE, his followers took the holy city of Mecca, and the expansion of Islam began at absolute lightning speed. It united the Arabian Peninsula, swept right across North Africa, and into Europe until the Battle of Tours in 732 CE. Then, centuries later, Pope Urban II called upon European Christians to take up arms, which led to the First Crusade capturing Jerusalem in 1099 CE. This whole dynamic sparked centuries of intense conflict as different faiths clashed for global and spiritual dominance.
Section 4. Conquest and Global Shifts.
Now, before we look at the conquerors of this era, we really have to look at the microbe. During this time, the bubonic plague spread along the Silk Road and merchant ships, creating a truly jaw-dropping death toll. We're talking between 75 million and 200 million people dead. But paradoxically, this immense, horrific loss of life actually completely upended the feudal system. Think about it. With so few workers left alive, the surviving farmers and peasants suddenly had immense leverage. Landowners had to grant them more rights and better wages, slowly but surely cracking the foundations of that rigid feudal pyramid.
At the exact same time, global power dynamics were violently shifting. In 1206, Genghis Khan united nomadic tribes to form the Mongol Empire, which rapidly conquered territory stretching all the way from Asia to Europe. Then, in 1453, the Ottoman Empire shocked the world by breaching the high walls of Constantinople, officially ending the remnants of the Byzantine Empire. Because of that Ottoman dominance, Europeans started looking for new trade routes. So Christopher Columbus sails west in 1492, reaching the Americas. And shortly after, in 1521, Hernán Cortés uses advanced weapons and local alliances to conquer the magnificent Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan. The Old World had violently collided with the New World.
This whole era of brutal conquest and absolute monarchs is perfectly captured by the political philosopher Niccolo Machiavelli. He observed the rulers of his day and wrote, "It is much safer to be feared than loved." And honestly, from the Spanish conquistadors to Ivan the Terrible in Russia, launching literal purges of terror against his own people, fear was the ultimate tool for preserving power and enforcing obedience.
Section 5. Renaissance to Revolution. Now, what's really interesting about this next transition is that the seeds of revolution actually started much earlier, way back in 1215 in England. The barons were totally fed up with King John's abuses, so they basically forced him to sign the Magna Carta. For the very first time, an absolute monarch's power was legally restricted. It established the right to a fair trial and the brilliant principle of habeas corpus, meaning the government actually has to provide a lawful reason for locking you up. This right here was the early legal foundation for modern justice.
From that one legal seed, we see a massive, rapid cascade of human achievement. The Renaissance just exploded as geniuses like Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo beautifully blended art, anatomy, and science. Meanwhile, in 1517, Martin Luther nails his 95 Theses to a church door, challenging the absolute authority of the Catholic Church and sparking the Protestant Reformation. That eventually leads to the brutal 30 Years' War, which ends with the Peace of Westphalia, creating the modern idea of individual sovereign nation-states. And to top it all off, thinkers like Adam Smith began publishing the foundational ideas of modern, self-balancing economics. In just a few centuries, the foundational rules of art, religion, and economics had been entirely rewritten.
Which brings us to a perfect thematic bookend for our journey. Far away from that ancient mandate of heaven granted to emperors, a group of American patriots stood in a room in Philadelphia in 1776 and signed a document declaring, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Power was no longer derived from divine right or absolute fear, but from the mandate of the people themselves."
So as we look back at the grand scope of this explainer, it's wild. We started as floating atoms, evolved into hominids, became physically diminished agricultural serfs, survived plagues and the swords of empires, and eventually became the architects of our own liberty and modern technology. Looking at this relentless cycle of rise and fall across thousands of years, what paradigm will human civilization build or destroy next? Think about that and keep learning.